The fall from the sky. The night had begun like any other for Adrian Blackstone, though the man himself would never call any night ordinary. At only 32, his name carried the weight of empires, whispered in boardrooms and splashed across magazine covers that celebrated the meteoric rise of a boy from nothing to a billionaire who commanded entire industries. Yet for all his influence and wealth, Adrian carried within him a restless emptiness that no acquisition, no mansion, and no tailored suit could ever soothe. He had boarded his private jet from New York that evening, heading to London for yet another summit where he would stand on a stage and declare innovations that would shake markets and thrill shareholders. But tonight, as the aircraft sliced through the clouds, his heart was heavier than his briefcase of contracts. The storm that met him in the night sky seemed almost designed for him alone, a furious reminder that all power is fragile when measured against nature's hand. The first strike of lightning tore across the heavens with a violence that seemed personal, illuminating the cabin in a brief, blinding flash. Adrian's fingers gripped the armrest of his leather seat as thunder cracked so loudly, it felt like the sky itself was tearing apart. His pilot's voice broke through the intercom, strained and urgent, telling him they needed to make an emergency landing. Somewhere ahead, through rain so dense it was almost solid, there was a small airfield. Adrian closed his eyes, his pulse hammering, and realized that in that instant, his billions meant nothing. Not 1 cent of his fortune could buy him safety. In that storm, not one connection could call off the rain. Not one deal could negotiate with the wind. The aircraft shook again, the engines whining as though protesting their cruel burden, and when the wheels finally touched the slick runway, the violence of the landing sent the cabin spinning into chaos. The world outside the window became a blur of rain, mud, and shadows of trees looming far too close. The plane skidded, lost its grip, and with a sickening lurch slid off the tarmac into a field where the sodden ground swallowed it whole. Metal screamed, glass cracked, and then came a sudden and awful silence, the kind of silence that makes a man wonder if he is still alive. Adrian's head throbbed as he lifted his hand and felt the warmth of blood. His pilot slumped forward, unmoving, and in that moment, a surge of responsibility broke through Adrian's daze. He might have been a billionaire in the world beyond, but here, in the wreckage of steel and storm, he was just another man fighting to survive. Staggering to his feet, he forced open the emergency exit, the storm instantly pummeling him with icy sheets of rain that soaked his tailored suit and nearly knocked him off balance. The world outside was dark, an endless curtain of water and wind, yet through the chaos a faint glow flickered in the distance. A light. It was small, fragile, like a candle flame trying to hold back the night, but it was enough to drag his weary legs forward. Adrian stumbled through mud and grass, his shoes ruined, his hair plastered to his forehead, his vision blurred by the relentless downpour. Every step seemed heavier than the last, his body screaming at him to stop, but the thought of his unconscious pilot gave him strength. Somewhere there had to be help. Somewhere someone lived within this storm. The closer he came to the light, the clearer it became. What at first seemed like a trick of his imagination revealed itself to be the warm glow of windows belonging to a cottage tucked among tall trees. The sight was surreal, almost dreamlike, as though he had wandered out of time into a place untouched by the ruthless pace of the world he knew. The walls were stone, crawling with ivy, and the light spilled out golden and soft, a stark defiance to the storm's cruelty. His fist, trembling with exhaustion, pounded on the heavy wooden door. For a moment he feared no one would answer, that the storm would swallow him whole before dawn, but then the latch turned and the door opened. Standing there was a young woman, her auburn hair catching the glow of the firelight inside, her green eyes wide with shock at the stranger before her. She was dressed simply, a white sweater flecked with paint stains, jeans worn soft by time. But in that instant she looked to Adrian like an angel carved out of the storm itself. Her gaze swept over him, taking in the blood, the soaked clothes, the unsteady sway of his frame. "Please," he gasped, his voice barely louder than the wind. "I need help. My plane crashed." His knees buckled even as he tried to stand tall, his world tilting, and before he collapsed completely, she caught him. Her arms were slender but strong, steadying him as though she had been waiting for this very moment. "Come inside," she urged, her voice calm yet urgent. "You're hurt. Quickly." The warmth of the cottage enveloped him like an embrace as she guided him to a couch near a crackling fire. The storm raged outside, but within these walls, the world seemed different, softer, protected. His last sight before darkness overtook him was her face leaning over his, those green eyes filled not with fear or calculation but with pure kindness. When he finally woke again, hours later, it was to the soft crackle of burning logs and the faint scent of lavender in the blanket wrapped around him. His head throbbed, but there was a cool cloth pressed gently to his forehead, and he realized with a start that someone had tended his wound with care. He shifted slightly, and the movement drew her back into the room. She entered quietly, carrying a mug that steamed in her hands, and when her eyes met his, they lit up with relief. "You're awake," she said softly. "I was starting to worry." Adrian tried to sit, pain spiking through his skull, but her hand was there instantly, steadying him, guiding him back against the cushions. "You've been out for 3 hours. I cleaned your wound and bandaged it. You've got a concussion, but it isn't too serious. You just need rest." Her voice was calm, soothing, as though she had known him for years. She placed the mug on the table and sat in a chair near the fire, her presence a quiet anchor against the storm's lingering fury outside. Adrian hesitated before speaking, his name one that could command respect or fear in the outside world. But something about her, about this place, made him long to set aside the weight of who he was supposed to be. "Adrian," he said simply. She smiled, and it was as if the clouds outside parted for a moment. "Well, Adrian," she replied, "you're lucky to be alive. I'm Rosalie Harper." Her name, spoken gently, felt like a promise of something unknown. He looked around the cottage, noticing paintings leaned against walls, sketches on the table, canvases that captured meadows, rivers, skies. The place was filled with art, filled with life. "You live here alone?" he asked, his voice still weak. She nodded. "I do. It's quiet, but I like it that way." As the firelight painted her face with warmth, Adrian realized something unsettling. For the first time in years, he felt not like a billionaire, not like a CEO, but like a man who had been pulled from the storm into the hands of fate. The emptiness he carried seemed to stir, as though daring to hope. The storm had brought him here, to this cottage, to this woman with paint-stained fingers and eyes that saw beyond his suit and his blood. And deep inside, Adrian Blackstone understood that this night, this fall from the sky was not an accident. It was the beginning of something he could not yet name. The world he never knew. When Adrian woke the next morning, the storm had softened into a steady drizzle that tapped gently against the window panes. For a moment he simply lay still, listening to the rhythmic sound, wrapped in the unfamiliar scent of lavender and wood smoke. His life, normally dictated by alarms, schedules, and assistants bustling around him with urgent reports, seemed very far away here. Instead, there was only the soft crackle of fire, the faint creak of old floorboards, and the warmth of the blanket around his shoulders. It took him several seconds to remember where he was, to recall the crash, the storm, the blood on his forehead, and the face of the woman who had saved him. Rosalie Harper was already awake when he sat up, her auburn hair pulled into a loose braid as she moved quietly in the small kitchen. The cottage was a place of simple beauty, its shelves lined with books worn by years of reading, its walls decorated with her own paintings. She glanced back as she noticed him stir, and her smile came easily like sunlight slipping through clouds. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying the same softness that had soothed him the night before. "You should still be resting, but I thought you might be hungry." On the table between them, she had placed a plate of toast, eggs, and fresh fruit, a meal that was ordinary by any measure, yet it struck Adrian as extraordinary in its care. He was used to silver trays rolled in by staff wearing pressed uniforms, meals crafted by chefs flown in from Paris or Milan. But here was something made by a single pair of hands, offered without expectation. He hesitated before picking up a slice of toast, and as he tasted it, he felt an odd warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the fire. "Thank you," he murmured, surprised by how much he meant it. She shrugged lightly. "It's nothing. You're my guest." Over the next few hours, Adrian moved slowly around the cottage, his body still aching but his mind alert. He studied her paintings more closely, realizing they were not simply depictions of landscapes but reflections of how she saw the world. A meadow under a storm was not just a place but a feeling, vibrant, alive, brimming with strength. A forest glade seemed to whisper with secrets, while a painting of the cottage itself glowed with the kind of warmth he had not felt in any of the penthouses he owned. "These are remarkable," he said as Rosalie joined him, her fingers stained, faintly blue from drying paint. She flushed slightly, brushing off the compliment. "They're just hobbies, something to keep me connected to this place." But Adrian had built his empire on recognizing talent, and he could see instantly that what she called a hobby was far more than that. He felt a strange tug inside him, the urge to nurture, to protect, to support, something he had never felt even for his shareholders or his colleagues. "You could sell these," he said thoughtfully. "They could hang in galleries, people would want them." She laughed, not mockingly but with gentle disbelief. "And leave this place? No, these are for me and maybe for the few who pass. But I don't need the world to approve of them." Her words unsettled him. All his life Adrian had sought approval, from investors, from markets, from headlines that declared him the next visionary. Yet here was a woman who created beauty without needing an audience, who found contentment in the act itself. He realized with a sudden jolt that he had no idea what that kind of peace felt like. The thought lingered with him as the rain eased, and Rosalie offered to show him the woods that surrounded her home. Wrapped in borrowed clothes that felt strange against his skin, Adrian followed her along narrow paths that wound between towering pines. The air was fresh, heavy with the scent of wet earth, and though his body protested with each step, there was a release in the rhythm of walking, in the absence of urgency. Rosalie spoke easily, pointing out hidden streams, wildflowers pushing through the damp soil, and even a small clearing where deer sometimes gathered. She seemed to know every tree, every stone, every corner of this world, as if the land itself had whispered its secrets to her. They stopped at a clearing where a waterfall spilled over dark rocks into a pool that mirrored the gray sky above. "This is my favorite place," Rosalie said, sitting gracefully on a fallen log. "When the world feels heavy, I come here." Adrian lowered himself beside her, staring at the water. He felt something shift within him, an unfamiliar ease that came not from conquering, not from acquiring, but from simply being. "It's beautiful," he admitted quietly, and for once he did not feel the need to compare it to anything, or to measure its value in currency. It was beautiful because it was hers, and because he was here with her. As the day gave way to evening, they returned to the cottage, where Rosalie lit lanterns that filled the space with warm light. She moved about the kitchen with an ease that spoke of years of simplicity, chopping vegetables, stirring a pot of soup, humming softly under her breath. Adrian offered to help, and though he confessed he had never cooked a meal in his life, she laughed and handed him a knife, teaching him how to slice carrots without losing a finger. They laughed together as he fumbled, and for the first time in years, Adrian felt something genuine break through the armor he wore. Joy, unpolished and real. Later, they sat by the fire with bowls of soup and mugs of tea, the storm outside a distant murmur. Their conversation drifted from books to dreams to fragments of their pasts. Rosalie spoke of her grandmother who had left her this cottage, and of her work in the small library in town. She confessed she had never traveled far, though she often dreamed of Paris, of standing in front of the great works of art she had only seen in books. Adrian listened, fighting the urge to reveal that he had been to Paris more times than he could count, that he had once hosted entire exhibitions in his name. Instead, he chose honesty in a different form, telling her how his parents had died when he was young, how work had become his way of filling the silence left behind. She looked at him then with eyes that seemed to see more than he said. "Maybe storms bring us where we need to be," she murmured. And in that moment, as the firelight flickered across her face, Adrian realized that the world he had always known, the world of deals and deadlines, of excess and applause, was only a fraction of what life could be. Here in this cottage, in the company of this woman, he was beginning to discover another world, one he had never dared to believe existed. A growing fire. The days that followed unfolded with a rhythm Adrian had never known before, a pace that was both unhurried and deeply meaningful. Each morning, he would wake to the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen, to the sound of Rosalie humming softly as she prepared breakfast. Sometimes he would find her already painting, her hair falling in loose strands around her face, her entire being absorbed in the canvas before her. He would stand quietly, watching the way her brush moved with both certainty and grace, capturing the soul of a scene rather than its details. In those moments he felt as though he were witnessing something sacred, something the world beyond those woods would never fully understand. Adrian, whose life had been dictated by meetings timed to the minute and schedules packed to the brim, found himself learning the art of stillness. Rosalie seemed to live in the spaces he had always overlooked, the slow warmth of a mug between two hands, the way light shifted through trees, the way silence could be comforting rather than suffocating. For a man who had been driven his entire life to conquer, acquire, and push forward, the simplicity of her world was both foreign and intoxicating. He began to help her with small tasks, stumbling at first but eager, chopping vegetables under her watchful eye, mending a fence with clumsy determination, fetching firewood from the shed despite the chill that lingered in the air. And with each new act, he felt himself unlearning old habits and discovering a life not measured in profits but in presence. One evening, after the rain had cleared, Rosalie led him on a walk through the woods. The sky was brushed with streaks of gold and violet, and the ground glistened from the recent storm. She showed him a path that curved past a meadow alive with wildflowers, their petals heavy with dew. They sat together on a weathered log, watching as the clouds drifted lazily across the fading sky. For a long time neither spoke, and yet the silence between them was not awkward but alive, filled with unspoken truths and growing possibility. Adrian glanced at her profile, at the way the light touched her hair, and felt a warmth in his chest. That had nothing to do with the setting sun. It was Rosalie who broke the silence, her voice thoughtful but steady. "Do you ever feel like you've been chasing something your whole life but you're not even sure what it is?" Adrian's heart lurched at the question. He thought of the skyscrapers with his name etched in steel, the press conferences, the headlines that praised him as a visionary, the empires built on his decisions. For all of it, for every milestone, he had never once felt complete. "Every day," he admitted softly, his voice almost lost to the whisper of the wind. She turned to look at him then, her green eyes open, searching, as though she could see, past the layers of wealth and reputation to the man beneath. In that moment something shifted. It was as if the storm that had thrown his plane from the sky had also cracked open the armor he had built around his heart. He found himself leaning closer, not deliberately, not planned, but drawn by an unseen force. Rosalie's hand rested on the log between them, paint still faintly staining her fingers, and before he could second-guess himself, his own hand moved, brushing lightly against hers. The contact was small, tentative, yet it sent a current through him that no boardroom victory had ever managed to spark. She did not pull away. Instead, her fingers curled slightly, acknowledging his, accepting without words. That night, back in the cottage, they cooked together again, the air filled with laughter as Adrian once more proved hopeless in the kitchen. He spilled flour across the counter, added far too much salt to the sauce, and nearly dropped a pan before Rosalie caught it with quick reflexes. "You're a disaster," she teased, her laughter ringing like music. "And yet," Adrian countered, smiling more freely than he had in years, "you keep letting me help." She tilted her head, her smile softening. "Because you're trying. That's worth more than getting it right." It was such a simple statement, but to a man who had lived under the crushing weight of perfection his entire life, it landed with the force of revelation. Later, as the fire crackled low and shadows danced across the walls, Adrian found himself watching her more than he intended. Rosalie sat cross-legged on the rug, a sketchbook balanced on her knees, her pencil moving lightly across the page. He wondered what she was drawing, but he did not ask. Instead, he let himself take in the sight of her, the way concentration softened her features, the way her lips curved slightly as she worked. He felt a stirring inside him that was both terrifying and exhilarating, the slow, undeniable realization that he was falling in love. Not the fleeting, shallow infatuations that had come with status and wealth, not the strategic partnerships dressed as romance that filled his world, but something real, something that reached into the core of who he was. The world outside had not forgotten him. On the third day, while Rosalie hung damp clothes by the fire, Adrian caught the faint crackle of a radio she kept on a shelf. A voice was speaking of a search effort launched after a billionaire's jet went missing over the Atlantic corridor, of rescue teams combing regions for wreckage. Adrian felt the walls of his old world pressing closer, the weight of his name threatening to break into the fragile sanctuary he had found here. Rosalie glanced at him curiously, unaware of how the words cut into him, and he realized with a sharp pang that he could not keep the truth from her forever. He was not merely Adrian, he was Adrian Blackstone, and sooner or later, the storm he had escaped would come roaring back. That night, as rain returned lightly against the windows, he lay awake on the couch, staring at the ceiling. Rosalie had given him shelter, care, and a glimpse of a life he had never believed possible. She knew only fragments of who he was, and yet she accepted him without hesitation. But what would she think when she learned the rest? Would she see the man who had laughed with her over spilled flour and crooked sketches? Or would she see the billionaire who owned empires and whose name carried expectations as heavy as iron? The fire had dwindled to embers when Rosalie appeared from the hallway, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes heavy with sleep. "Can't sleep?" she asked softly. Adrian shook his head. She crossed the room and sat beside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, almost without thinking, Adrian reached up, his hand brushing gently against her cheek. She didn't flinch, didn't move away. Instead, her eyes fluttered closed, and she leaned into his touch, a breath escaping her lips. The moment hung between them, fragile and charged, filled with a promise neither dared to speak. And in that silence, Adrian knew with a certainty that shook him. The fire between them was no longer something either of them could ignore. Truths in the storm. The fourth day began with the sun piercing through ragged clouds, casting streaks of light across the drenched woods. Adrian woke with a heaviness in his chest that had nothing to do with his injuries. He could feel the weight of time pressing against the fragile bubble he had found with Rosalie. A reminder that the world he had tried to hold back was steadily closing in. Each hour spent in her cottage felt both like a gift and a countdown, for he knew the search teams would find him sooner rather than later. Yet as he watched Rosalie move about her small kitchen, humming softly while arranging wildflowers in a jar, he felt the almost desperate urge to freeze time, to hold on to this simple piece that had become more valuable than all the luxuries he had left behind. Rosalie, unaware of the magnitude of the man sitting at her table, continued to treat him as though he were no more and no less than the man who had stumbled into her home from the storm. She spoke of little things. A book she had been reading at the library, the odd way the clouds seemed to gather over the meadow before rain, her grandmother's recipes for soups that could warm even the coldest winter. Adrian listened, captivated, not by the content but by the way her words carried a quiet strength, a steady rhythm of a life lived with sincerity. And yet, each time she smiled at him, guilt stirred within him. He had built their fragile bond on a half-truth, introducing himself simply as Adrian, when in reality he was a man whose name could command headlines. That afternoon, Rosalie suggested they walk again, this time to the edge of the lake that lay hidden behind the forest. The air smelled of damp leaves, and the ground squelched softly under their boots. The lake stretched wide, its surface silvered by the pale sun, and the reflection of the sky shimmered with a fragile beauty. They sat on a rock by the shore, the stillness around them broken only by the occasional ripple as a fish surfaced. Rosalie's voice was calm but probing when she asked, "What will you do when you leave here? You must have people looking for you." Adrian's heart stuttered. It was a simple question but layered with meaning. He hesitated, searching for the right words, knowing that the truth, once spoken, would change everything. "I do," he admitted slowly. "But I don't know if I want to go back to them. Not yet." He looked out at the water, at the sky's reflection that seemed as restless as his soul. "For the first time in years, I feel like I'm not performing, like I'm not carrying the weight of expectations. Being here, with you, it's different." Rosalie studied him, her expression unreadable, and for a moment, he wondered if she had already guessed the truth he carried. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. "Different can be good, but different doesn't last if it's built on lies." The words pierced him, because though she did not know the details, she had somehow touched the very wound inside him. He wanted to tell her everything right then, to lay bare his name, his empire, his fears. But fear gripped him just as tightly, fear that once she knew, she would no longer look at him the way she did now, not as a man, but as a symbol, as a billionaire whose life was too big, too complicated for her small cottage world. That evening, as the wind picked up again and the sky darkened with the promise of yet another storm, Adrian sat by the fire with Rosalie. The tension between them had grown heavier, not from distance but from all the words unsaid. She sat close, her knees drawn under her blanket, her gaze flickering between the fire and him. He finally spoke, his voice raw. "Rosalie, there's something I need to tell you. I haven't been completely honest." She turned to him slowly, her eyes steady but wary. "Go on." The words caught in his throat, but he forced them forward. "My name. It's not just Adrian. It's Adrian Blackstone." The name landed in the air with weight, a truth that had shaped his entire life. He searched her face for recognition, and he saw it. A flicker of shock, of realization. She knew the name. Everyone did. Her lips parted, but she said nothing, and the silence stretched, more painful than any word she could have spoken. "I didn't tell you because..." He exhaled, his hands running through his hair. "Because every time people know who I am, they see the empire, the wealth, the power. They stop seeing me. And here, for the first time in so long, I felt like I was just a man. Just me. I didn't want to lose that." His voice cracked on the last words, not from weakness but from the sheer vulnerability of admitting them. Rosalie's eyes shimmered with something he couldn't read. Hurt, disbelief, perhaps even betrayal. "You should have told me," she said softly, her voice breaking just enough to make his chest ache. "Do you know what it feels like to open your home, to open your heart, only to realize you've been letting in someone who wasn't who he said he was?" Adrian reached for her hand, but she pulled it back, her green eyes brimming with conflict. He wanted to plead, to tell her that the man who had laughed with her in the kitchen, who had stumbled through chopping vegetables, who had marveled at her paintings and walked with her through the rain, that was the real Adrian. Not the billionaire in the headlines, not the tycoon feared in boardrooms. But he knew words alone would not be enough. The storm outside broke with sudden fury, rain hammering the roof, thunder shaking the windows. It felt like an echo of the turmoil inside the cottage, of the storm raging between them. Rosalie stood, her blanket slipping from her shoulders, and for a moment Adrian thought she would tell him to leave, that their fragile bond had shattered beyond repair. Instead, she turned toward him, her voice trembling but strong. "What do you want from me, Adrian? Are you sure you want this? A life that is so far from your world with someone who has nothing to offer but herself?" Her question cut to the very center of him. He stood too, his heart pounding, his voice thick with emotion. Yes, he said without hesitation, his eyes locked on hers. I don't want your world to change. I don't want your art, your cottage, your peace to disappear into mine. I want you, Rosalie, not because of what you can give me, but because of what you've already given me without even trying. Truth, kindness, something real. His voice dropped, almost a whisper. I am sure, more sure than I've ever been of anything in my life. The firelight flickered between them, casting shadows that seemed to dance with their words. Rosalie's hands trembled, and though her eyes still carried doubt, something within them softened. She looked at him long and hard, as though weighing not his empire but his soul. Outside, the storm raged, but within those stone walls the truth had been spoken, raw and unvarnished. And whether it would bind them closer or tear them apart, Adrian knew that this was the moment on which everything hinged. The answer. The storm outside raged well into the night, its fury shaking the windows and rattling the roof as though determined to tear the little cottage apart. But inside, the greater storm was not of wind or rain, but of hearts pulled in two directions. Rosalie stood near the fire, her hands clasped tightly, her face pale beneath the shifting glow of the flames. Adrian watched her, his chest heavy, his mind filled with questions he could not answer for her. He had spoken his truth, stripped himself of every shield and every mask, and now it was she who held the power to decide what came next. Hours seemed to pass in silence, the only sound the crash of thunder and the restless crackle of the fire. Adrian wanted to close the distance between them, to take her hands in his, but he knew this was a battle he could not fight for her. She had to choose for herself, and he had to accept that choice no matter the pain it might bring. He had faced hostile takeovers, collapsing markets, betrayals in boardrooms, but never had he felt so powerless as he did now, standing in front of a woman whose acceptance mattered more than any fortune he had ever built. Finally, Rosalie turned to him. Her eyes were bright with tears, though her voice was steady when she spoke. Adrian, I don't know how to live in your world. I don't know how to stand beside a man whose life is so big, so loud, so far from anything I've ever known. I am just me, a woman who paints, who works in a library, who has never left this place. What do I have that could possibly fit in your world? Her words broke something inside him, not because of the doubt they carried, but because of how wrong she was. He stepped closer, his voice low but urgent. Rosalie, you have everything that my world is missing. Do you think I care about the titles, the money, the attention? I've had them all, and none of it made me feel alive. But here, with you, eating soup by a fire, watching you paint, laughing when I spill flour, that is more real than anything I've ever known. I don't want to drag you into my world. I want to leave it behind for this, for us. She searched his face as though looking for cracks, for any sign that this was just another performance from a man used to getting what he wanted. But what she saw there was not arrogance or persuasion. It was vulnerability, raw and unguarded. Adrian Blackstone, the billionaire, the empire builder, stood before her not as a man who commanded worlds, but as a man who simply asked for her heart. Her tears finally fell, sliding down her cheeks as she whispered, "And if I say yes? If I say I want this, are you sure you'll still want it when the world comes crashing back? When people look at me and see nothing but someone unworthy of you?" Adrian reached out then, cupping her face, gently, his thumb brushing away her tears. "I don't care how the world sees you," he said, his voice breaking with the intensity of his conviction. "I care how I see you. And I see the woman who saved me in a storm, who showed me what kindness feels like, who made me remember what it means to be human. That's all I want, Rosalie. That's all I'll ever want." For a long moment she said nothing. The fire popped, the thunder roared, the rain battered the roof. Then, slowly, she lifted her hand and laid it against his chest, feeling the steady, desperate rhythm of his heart. Her voice was soft, trembling but filled with a strength that made him catch his breath. "Then yes, I want this too." The words broke through him like sunlight piercing storm clouds. Relief, joy, and awe surged through him all at once, and before he could think, He drew her into his arms. She did not resist. Instead, she melted against him, her arms wrapping tightly around his waist as though afraid he might vanish if she let go. The storm outside raged on, but within the cottage, a new stillness settled. The kind that comes, not from absence but from fulfillment, from two hearts that had finally found their place. The following morning dawned clear, the sky washed clean and brilliant blue. The air smelled of pine and wet earth, and sunlight poured across the meadow like gold. Adrian woke to find Rosalie beside him, still asleep, her auburn hair fanned across the pillow. For a long time he simply watched her, marveling at the peace etched across her features. He thought of the life waiting for him beyond this place, the assistants, the meetings, the endless demands, and realized with certainty that none of it mattered anymore. He had found something far greater, something he had never thought possible. Love that asked for nothing but truth. Love that had been born not of wealth or status, but of storms and survival. When the sound of engines finally reached them later, that day, rescue teams combing the countryside, Rosalie looked at him with fear in her eyes. "They'll take you back," she whispered. Adrian shook his head, his hand tightening around hers. "They can take me back to the city," he said firmly. "But they can't take me from you. I won't let them. If I have to choose between the world I built and the world I've found with you, Rosalie, I will choose you. Every time." Her tears returned, but this time they were tears of joy. She nodded, squeezing his hand. And as they stepped outside, the meadow glowing under the morning sun, the storm nothing but a memory, Adrian knew that his answer had already been written, not in contracts or headlines, but in the simple truth that he had found the only thing his billions could never buy. He had found her,